60 years, $6.4 billion, locked in the name of stability. But to a continent bled dry, it was called something else: theft. In the heart of Paris, beneath marble floors and portraits of dead governors, a man in a red beret walks into the Banque de France. No entourage, no excuses, just truth. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. And what he carries isn't just paper, it's proof. Proof that for over half a century, Africa's wealth was exported, hoarded, and renamed aid. In front of silent cameras, he slams the dossier down. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. You took it. Now, return it. And in that moment, the walls don't shake, but the silence does. Because this isn't just about money. It's about dignity buried under policies, about a nation tired of waiting to be heard. But ask yourself this: if justice is delayed for 6 decades, is it still justice at all? Or is it finally revolt disguised as restoration? The room is silent, unnaturally so. Inside the high-ceilinged chamber of the Banque de France, the light is white cold, almost surgical. The floor is polished marble, the chairs gold-trimmed, and lining the wall are oil paintings. Men in powdered wigs holding scrolls and pens, frozen in time signatures that once split continents. At the center of the room, a long gleaming table, and standing at one end of it in quiet defiance is Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. No notes, no teleprompter, no translator, just a thick leather-bound folder in his left hand clenched like a weapon. Across from him sit 8 French official suits tight with protocol. One of them is President Macron, arms folded, eyes unreadable. The air feels loaded, like a match hovering over spilled fuel. "Shall we continue?" a French banker asks, gently, almost nervously. He gestures toward the folder. "If you have additional requests," Mr. President Traoré doesn't speak. Instead, he walks slowly to the center of the room. The double doors opened with a mechanical whoosh. Trump entered alone, no aides, no preamble. His posture was rigid, jaw tight. The usual smirk that played on his lips before bantering with the press was gone. This was not theater. It was something colder. He approached the podium without eye contact, slapped a thin stack of papers onto the wood, and stared out like a man watching a storm roll in. "This won't be long," he said, voice flat. The first clue that this wasn't a normal morning came when he skipped the scripted remarks. He didn't even glance at the pages in front of him. "There's a member of Congress," he began, "who thinks she's above the law." Some reporters lifted their eyes from their notes. Others raised their phones. No names yet. But the tone had shifted. A radical voice, he continued, spreading misinformation, inciting division, undermining national integrity. Then came the pause, the kind that makes your stomach knot. He looked directly into the camera, but no one speaks. The silence grows teeth. Outside, the rain begins to tap the window panes like a ticking clock. Inside, the only sound is the slow hiss of Traoré opening the folder. Papers slide out, some yellowed with time, some marked with top secret, others with ink so faded it looks like it bled from history itself. There's a photo, a man in handcuffs, a date 1973, a stamp classified, Banque de France Internal Affairs. "You called it stabilization," Traoré says. "We called it extraction." He lifts another document, a ledger. The number is underlined twice, 465 francs. Next to it, the word detained. The camera zooms in on a bead of sweat rolling down the side of one official's face. "For 6 decades, Traoré continues, we've sent grain, gold, and goodwill. You returned conditions, contracts, and quotas." A pause. "Now we're sending something back to you. The bill." Macron leans forward. "You're demanding reparations?" he asks, his voice tight. Traoré closes the folder slowly. "No, I'm demanding the return of what was never yours." Then he looks straight into the camera, because yes, this meeting is being recorded. It's already streaming live on feeds across West Africa. In a village in Burkina Faso, children gather around a battery-powered radio. In a cafe in Bamako, eyes are fixed on a small television. And in a dorm room in Dakar, a student whispers, "He's actually doing it." Traoré turns just slightly and says, "If you believe your nation is too proud to admit theft, then perhaps it is not proud, just afraid." But we are not. He steps back. The folder sits in the center of the table, heavy with history. No one dares to touch it. The folder remained in the center of the table, its spine-frayed edges curled like a relic unearthed from under the weight of time itself. No one moved to touch it. Only Traoré leaned forward, unfastening the worn leather straps, lifting the first sheet with the same care one might give to sacred scripture. The paper was brittle. The ink had faded to a tired brown, but the words were unmistakable. Déposé Courton juillet 1962. Montant 126 000 francs CFA. Provenance Haute-Volta. One of the French officials shifted uncomfortably. Another lowered their gaze. Traoré laid the page flat, then revealed another. And another. Each one stamped, dated, signed. Documents of transfers, temporary holdings, gold guarantees, withheld interests. Some carried bold headers, Accords Monétaires Confidentiels. Others bore discreet initials in red BDF Inti Banque de France Internal. As the stack grew, so did the silence. Every page a receipt, every receipt a reminder. And then without a word, Traoré placed a photograph beside the papers. It was black and white, grainy. A group of children crouched beneath a thorn tree, notebooks in their laps, dust swirling around bare feet. In the foreground, a boy barely 10 held up a chalkboard, splintered at the corners. On it, written in shaky French liberté, the image lingered. "We kept teaching," Traoré said quietly, even when the rain washed the chalk off the wood. He pulled out a second photo. This one in color, faded and scratched. A hospital ward roof leaking with patients hooked to IV drips, made from soda bottles, beds lined with mosquito nets stitched from old flour sacks. Next to the photo, a page dated 1981. Fonds de développement gelé pour cause d'instabilité régionale. Traoré paused. His eyes scanned the room, not with anger, but with the cold steadiness of someone who stopped asking for permission to be heard. "You froze billions," he said, voice steady. "And yet we kept the lights on with candles. We delivered babies under mobile phone flashlights." He lifted a handwritten letter next its paper, thinned by time, its edges yellow. The signature read Jean-Baptiste Yamergo, once a finance minister. In it, he pleaded with the French Treasury to release funds for fertilizer ahead of a regional drought. The letter was never answered. Traoré didn't need to say it. The story was already loud in its silence. Next, he unfolded a government memo from 1994, Intérêts cumulés, 2.1 milliards. Versement reporté. Justification, stabilité, monétaire commune. Translation, accrued interest 2.1 billion. Payment postponed. Justification, shared monetary stability. And then came the final item, a small paper envelope sealed in wax. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single coin, a colonial-era franc, tarnished dull, still bearing the emblem of empire. Traoré placed it gently on top of the stack. "You told us this coin meant civilization, that it carried your face because we weren't yet ready to bear our own." His hand hovered over the papers, the photos, the coin, the evidence of decades wrapped in quiet, almost reverent fury. He leaned back. "This," he said softly, "is not just a folder. It's a funeral file for every chance we were told to wait for." And for a brief second, the room changed. It wasn't Paris anymore. It was a hot afternoon in Ouagadougou. It was a teacher drawing math problems on tree bark. It was a mother boiling water by candlelight in a darkened maternity ward. It was a government writing letters that would never be opened. This was the moment the cost of silence became visible. The French officials said nothing. Because what could they say when the evidence spoke not in numbers, but in the names never printed, the roads never paved, and the futures delayed like overdue payments no one ever intended to make? The folder lay still on the table, its contents spread like quiet indictments. For a long moment, the room sat frozen in its own echo. President Macron cleared his throat softly, almost reflexively. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, leaned forward slightly, and spoke. "Perhaps it's time we move from confrontation to dialogue. These documents are serious, but diplomacy has room for complexity." "No," his tone was even measured. Too measured. Traoré didn't respond right away. His gaze was fixed not on Macron, but on the coin still resting atop the pile. The old colonial franc, dull and cold, seemed to weigh more than metal ever should. "Dialogue," he finally said, almost to himself. "Dialogue began in 1960. It died in silence in your archives." Macron exhaled quietly. A diplomat beside him opened a leather folder already prepared with potential statements, economic projections, reassurances. Another reached for a carefully printed communique toward a renewed partnership. Traoré stepped back from the table. He didn't touch the folder. He didn't shake hands. Instead, he looked across the room, slowly, deliberately meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "There is nothing more to negotiate," he said. "You do not need more time. You've had 6 decades." Someone shifted in their seat. The moment felt suddenly fragile. Not angry, not explosive, but irreversible, like the final click of a lock closing. Macron stood. The movement was hesitant, uncertain. "President Traoré," he began, tone now firm but polished, "you must understand that these matters are interlinked. Currency, investment, stability. France is not your enemy." Traoré looked at him not dismissively, but with a quiet that cut deeper than accusation. "No, you were never the enemy. But you were the accountant of our suffering, and your books are overdue." He turned to leave. As he reached the doorway, he paused, not dramatically, but with intention. Without turning back, he said, "You can keep your chairs. We're building our own table." And then he walked out. Not rushed, not triumphant, just done. Outside the Banque de France, the air had changed. A crowd had formed, small, quiet, alert. Journalists with long lenses, students in Pan-African scarves, a grandmother holding a sign with no words, just a black coin drawn in marker. Traoré stepped into the street, flanked by no guards, no applause, just the sound of camera shutters clicking in rhythm. But it wasn't the cameras that mattered. It was what happened next. At first, it began on a student's phone in Dakar, a clip 12 seconds long of Traoré's voice echoing off marble walls. "You can keep your chairs. We're building our own table." Then it spread to Ouagadougou, then Abidjan, Lagos, Bamako. By midnight, the hashtag had reached Johannesburg, Kinshasa, Nairobi. Hashtag return what you took. Hashtag bring it back. Hashtag not aid but out. Each tag carried its own weight, but the core message was the same. This was no longer about one man. It wasn't just about vaults or folders or handshakes withheld. It was about a generation that had inherited the silence and was finally choosing to speak. By dawn, murals had begun appearing on walls across West Africa, spray-painted silhouettes of a man in a red beret, one hand resting on a folder, the other pointing outward. And beneath every image, the same phrase, "We're building our own table." The plane touched down on the faded tarmac of Ouagadougou International Airport just after noon. The sun hung directly overhead, casting hard shadows on the concrete and heat rippling above the taxi lanes. There were no reporters waiting, no red carpets, no motorcade. Assetou Diarra stepped off the aircraft with only a single carry-on bag and a weathered envelope tucked under her arm. Inside that envelope was a photo creased at the corners, faintly water damaged. It showed a young man standing beside a rusted Peugeot camera slung over his shoulder, one hand raised in a half-wave that never quite reached the lens. The smile was half-formed, the eyes serious. The year was 1984. The man was her father. She hadn't seen him since she was 8. No one met her at the terminal. She didn't expect anyone to. Her arrival wasn't a homecoming, it was a return, but to a country that now remembered her name more from courtrooms than from headlines. Assetou Diarra, former International Criminal Court judge, legal architect behind the Kigali reparations framework, fierce advocate for post-colonial accountability. But here in the soil her father once walked, she was still just the journalist's daughter. Outside, the taxi queue buzzed with murmured French diola and static from old radios. Assetou approached a weathered cab and gave the driver an address she had written from memory, not because she had been there recently, but because it hadn't changed since 1991. Quartier Gungen, Rue 18, the old compound. "If it's still standing?" The driver nodded without surprise. "Ah, the Diarra house," he said, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "No one's lived there in years, but the walls remember." She looked out the window as the city rolled by, vivid, cracked, alive. Vendors selling roasted corn on metal trays. Children chasing each other across sun-baked courtyards. Billboards with the image of Traoré in black and white half-profile, the now famous phrase printed in bold under his face. "We're building our own table." But for Assetou, this wasn't about tables. It was about Paige's missing ones. Her father Malik Diarra had written stories in ink that vanished faster than headlines could fade. He had once investigated offshore accounts foreign-owned mines buried treaties, and then in 1990 he vanished too. The official report called it a car accident in Mali, but no vehicle was ever found. Just a bent press badge mailed anonymously to their doorstep 3 weeks later. That was the day her childhood ended. Assetou had left Burkina Faso with her mother shortly after. She studied in the Netherlands, rose through legal ranks faster than most dared to try, and delivered closing arguments at The Hague that made seasoned prosecutors hold their breath. But the courtroom never answered the question that stayed with her at night. Where did they bury the truth? The taxi stopped in front of a low concrete wall chipped with time bougainvillea, spilling through the cracks like defiant veins. The gate was ajar, no lock, no ceremony. She stepped out slowly, the dry air thick with dust and memory. Inside the compound was quiet. A few broken tiles lined the veranda. The paint on the door had long since faded to chalk, but she recognized the scent charcoal soil faint hibiscus. She entered the house and stood in the old front room. Her eyes scanned the floor where her father once scribbled edits in red pen, the corner where his radio always hummed low in the background, the ceiling fan that never worked, but always spun out of habit or hope. She knelt beside an old storage trunk and ran her hand across its surface. Then she opened the envelope again, holding up the photograph to the light from the window. "I'm not here for grief," she whispered. "I'm here for evidence." Her voice didn't echo. The walls absorbed it like they'd been waiting. Outside, her phone buzzed. A message flashed on the screen: tomorrow 10 a.m. Ministry of Justice. Confidential session. Topic: Banque de France archives. She closed the photo, zipped her bag. This time she didn't come to testify. She came to reopen a case that history tried to close. The room they gave her at the ministry wasn't large, but it was cold, well lit and quiet like a courtroom without the weight of audience. There was no flag on the wall, no portrait of Traoré, just bare concrete, a long wooden table, and a portable whiteboard already rolled into the corner. Assetou Diarra didn't need more. She opened her suitcase, set it on the table, and began laying out folders carefully, methodically. No theatrics, no rhetoric, just documents. Some were carbon copies, others digitized printouts. Some smelled faintly of mildew, others freshly unsealed. She took a black marker and wrote 3 words in bold on the whiteboard: unpaid, coerced, erased. Then she turned to the officials seated across from her, young, sharp-eyed lawyers from the Transitional Justice Team. One wore a badge clipped to her lapel that read, Truth Reconciliation Unit. Another had a notepad already open, pen poised. "This is not a theory," Diarra began calmly. "It's a trail." She lifted the first memo, a thin slip from 1971, stamped confidential. BDF Interior. It detailed an agreement between France and Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, mandating the transfer of 80% of foreign currency reserves to Banque de France in exchange for economic stabilization guarantees. There was no signatory from the African side, just a note that said consent presumed based on Framework Accord, July 1960. Consent presumed, Diarra repeated, holding up the page. That's how theft becomes policy. She pinned it to the whiteboard. Then came a repayment schedule from 1982, a list of interest payments that had been frozen during coups but never reinstated. Some entries were crossed out in red pen, others labeled pending revaluation. But the sum at the bottom was unmistakable. 3.4 billion francs CFA retained. Diarra added the figure below the memo, writing slowly, underlining twice. That money, she said, was held in the name of stability, but it never returned. Not as aid, not as reinvestment. It vanished into silence. Then she paused. But none of that was what first made my father nervous. She reached for a thin folder labeled simply Panafricain, numero 17, 1976. Inside was a half-finished article typed on a faded Olivetti typewriter. The first page bore a headline, The Vault No One Sees. Beneath it, Malik Diarra had written, If currency is blood, then what artery drains us in daylight while calling it protection? The article included references to a vault in Paris, one that stored not only funds, but the collateral reserves of every CFA franc-using country. Malik had tracked shipping logs, satellite photos, and obscure mentions in diplomatic telegrams. But the last paragraph ended mid-sentence. Some sources claim the vault's contents are leveraged through a "we could stop there." No conclusion, no follow-up. Just a second page with the word "rejected" stamped diagonally across it in red ink. He never published it, Asedu said quietly. A week later, he left for Bamako. He never came back. She pinned the unfinished article to the wall beside the bank memos. The room was silent now, no scribbling, no typing. Just the sound of air conditioning humming like distant wind. Dira walked slowly to the end of the whiteboard. She picked up one last page, a signed colonial-era agreement from 1959 marked interim protocol. The language was elegant, almost poetic. But at the heart of it, one sentence stood out. In exchange for financial guardianship, member states shall forfeit direct monetary sovereignty until such time as stability is deemed permanent. She circled the phrase, "until such time as stability is deemed permanent." "Tell me," she said, looking up, "who decides when we're stable?" No one answered, because everyone knew the answer. And that's when she said it without anger, but with unmistakable finality. "My father chased a vault he was never allowed to see." "I'm not here to finish his article. I'm here to open the door." She stepped back. The whiteboard behind her was full now. Bank memos, unpaid interest, coerced treaties, a half-written article, and one journalist's voice preserved by his daughter. The press conference wasn't scheduled. No official memo had been sent. But by early morning, word had already spread from campus whisper networks to dusty courtyards where transistor radios still hummed. Something was coming. By 10:00 a.m., the University of Ouagadougou's old lecture hall was packed wall to wall. Law students, professors, journalists, and those who had never stepped into a courtroom but carried the scars of its absence. There was no stage, only a small wooden podium pushed to the center of the room. No national flags, no government seal. Just a microphone and the weight of anticipation. Asedu Diarra stepped forward. She wore no robe, no pin, no judge's formality, only a simple white blouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and the calm resolve of someone who knew exactly what she was about to ignite. "This is not revenge," she began. "Let me say that first." The murmurs settled. "This is not about pity. We are not asking to be felt sorry for. We are demanding the math." A few pens scratched paper. Cameras clicked, but most just listened. "For 64 years," she continued, "our nations were told we were unstable. That stability required sacrifice. That sovereignty must be shared so long as the sharing was one-sided." She reached into a folder and pulled out a single sheet, a chart, simple but undeniable compound interest accrued on frozen reserves from 1960 to 2024. "This is not theory," she said, holding it up. "This is arithmetic. When a country deposits its wealth and receives conditions instead of credit, when its assets become your leverage, not its lifeline, when the returns never return, that's not partnership. That's extraction." A pause. They called it cooperation. We call it colonialism with a calculator. There was a stir, half disbelief, half awakening. Then came the moment that would be replayed a million times across phones, feeds, and lecture screens. You do not get to design a system, rig the math, and call the result mutual. We are not here to negotiate charity. We are here to reclaim the missing numbers, the withheld futures. This is not revenge. It's reconciliation with interest. Applause rose, restrained but powerful. In the back row, a visiting scholar from Ghana live-streamed the speech on his cracked phone. Across town, a history teacher projected it onto his chalk-streaked classroom wall. By noon, it was already being subtitled in Swahili. By nightfall, it had aired unofficially on a late-night French media segment titled La Vérité qui dérange, the truth that disrupts. The camera zoomed in as Asetu concluded, her voice steady but soft like a verdict read by memory. "We will present every receipt, every erased signature, every broken ledger. We are not coming with grief. We are coming with records." She stepped back from the mic. No anthem played, no slogans chanted. But the silence afterward was electric, like breath being collectively held across a continent. Later that evening, in a small office lit by a single desk lamp, Asetu reviewed a growing spreadsheet, legal references, case law, treaty breaches. At the top, she typed the heading, "Plaintiffs the People, formerly known as beneficiaries," and beneath it in bold, "Claim not aid." Ode. It began on a Tuesday morning. No marching bands, no speeches. Just the low hum of city life drifting around the Ministry of Finance papers, shuffled behind windows. Sandals scraped across sidewalk dust. A tea vendor stirred a pot on the corner without looking up. And then her. She came alone. Elderly, slow-moving, dressed in a faded blue wrapper, printed with the outline of a broken calabash. Her sandals were worn thin. Her back bent not from age but from memory. In her hands a single stone. It wasn't polished, it wasn't carved. It looked like it had been dug from the edge of an old riverbed. But on its flat surface, someone she likely had written in chalk, Hama Cabaret, 1952-1975. He waited. So we speak. She placed it just outside the gates of the ministry, directly beneath the brass plate that read République du Burkina Faso, Ministère de l'Économie et des Finances. Then she turned and left. No announcement, no explanation. But the guards noticed, and soon so did others. By mid-afternoon, there were 6 more stones. One bore the name of a midwife who died during a blackout in 1986. Another was for a boy lost to a preventable cholera outbreak in 1993. Most simply listed names and dates. Some added short inscriptions, she paid. But the clinic never opened. He studied by candlelight until the cancer won. They taxed us. We drank from wells. No one shouted. No one asked for permission. They just came. By dusk, the footpath in front of the ministry had become a quiet mosaic of names. Dozens of stones, each with white chalk handwriting. Some were wrapped in fabric. Some accompanied by small tokens, dried flowers, coins, black and white photos folded at the edges. People came from across the city and soon from villages outside it. Women with empty water pails placed their stones like offerings. School children pressed their palms to them before heading home. Elders stood and watched, nodding, not in protest but in recognition. Inside the ministry, the windows remained closed. But everyone noticed. A staffer from the treasury stood by the blinds watching in silence. A janitor refused to sweep them aside. By the following morning, the news had reached the radios. They didn't call it a protest. They called it La Marche des Noms Perdus, the March of Lost Names. Daira heard about it late that night. She visited quietly alone. No cameras, just her standing in front of the first stone. She knelt slowly, fingers tracing the words. He waited. So we speak. Then she placed her own. It was small, oval, smoothed by time. She had found it outside her father's childhood home. 2 days earlier, pocketed it without knowing why. Now she wrote on it in trembling white chalk. Malik Daira, 1949-1990. Truth leaves footprints. She placed it beside the others and stood up, brushing dust from her skirt. As she turned to leave, a young man approached, a university student, clutching a stone of his own. He looked nervous, uncertain. Is this allowed? He asked. Daira paused. It isn't about permission, she said softly. It's about memory that refuses to die quietly. That night, the stones glowed under moonlight and flashlight, their chalk marks fading slightly in the breeze, but refusing to vanish. By the end of the week, there were more than 300. People had begun calling it the wall without mortar. No bricks, no orders, just names, and the silent, sacred defiance of remembering. And beneath every stone, whether visible or implied, the same quiet message, we remember. And that means it's not over. It started quietly like most revolutions do. A primary school teacher in Bobo Dioulasso brought a small stone to class. On it, she had written a name in white chalk, Amadou Sawadogo, 1943-1991, and placed it on her desk without explanation. The students noticed, of course. Children always do. One boy raised his hand, asking if it was someone famous. Another guessed it was her father. The teacher shook her head. He was a farmer, she said. He saved for 15 years to build a school. He died waiting for the grant that never came. Then she wrote the name on the blackboard and told the children, "Today we are not learning from books. Today we are learning from names." She passed around small slips of paper, each with a different name, copied from the stones outside the ministry. The children took turns standing up, reading them aloud, some stumbling, some whispering, some speaking with a strange, quiet pride. Mariam Bationo, 1956-1989. Nurse. Issouf Traoré, 1965-2002. Minor. Fatoumata Ouedraogo, 1948-1997. Sold mangoes in Koudougou. At first, they didn't understand the weight of the names, but as they read, something shifted. The names began to feel like more than syllables. They became echoes of stories never written down. By the end of the week, other schools had followed. In classrooms from Ouagadougou to Kaya, name reading became a silent ritual. Not a sign, not graded, just witnessed. And outside the classroom, the elders began to speak. In village courtyards beneath neem trees and flickering oil lamps, grandparents told stories they had once swallowed like sand. Of banks that closed before harvest season, of foreign trucks that came for gold but left no roads, of official letters promising development stamped and signed but never delivered. One elder, Tonton Issa, stood before his grandchildren and opened a battered tin box. Inside were brittle passbooks never redeemed. One entry read, "Deposit $15,000 CFA, Purpose Teacher Training Fund, 1972. The balance had never changed. "I wasn't stupid," he said. "I trusted something that never intended to give back." His granddaughter, only 12, looked up and whispered, "Can we write his name on a stone?" In cities, radio programs began collecting oral testimonies, reading a new name every hour, names that had been erased from systems but lived in family stories. "This is not about blame," one host said. "This is about remembering the invoice they told us was imaginary." In churches, imams' sermons, and market stalls, the names began to surface like long-buried seeds cracking open beneath the heat of truth. Some were shouted, some were sung, some simply murmured into the wind as if telling history itself. "We have not forgotten you." Social media began to fill with hashtags like hashtag say their names, hashtag dead of silence, hashtag chalk justice. A photo of a barefoot child standing next to a chalk stone went viral. Her school uniform frayed her eyes steady. The caption read, "They took what built her school. She gives it back with a name." That week, Diarra visited a classroom in Zignere where second graders were drawing portraits of names they had never met. One girl had drawn a woman selling oranges with a quote bubble that said, "I gave them sweetness. They gave me receipts." Diarra paused, holding back something between sorrow and awe. Because this was no longer just about ledgers and treaties. It was about memory correcting the official record, about children speaking names that history had tried to bury in budget lines. And for the first time in decades, the silence that had ruled generations broke, not in rage, but in remembering. It began with one building, then 3, then 20. By the end of the week, every major government building in Ouagadougou, ministries, courts, tax offices, post stations bore them stones. Quiet, unmoving, deliberate. At the foot of each front step in rows along the sidewalk, beneath national emblems and freshly painted signs lay names written in chalk. No one organized it. No decrees were issued. No one asked for permission. But the city transformed, not in chaos, but in memory. At the Ministry of Education, teachers came before school to place their stones in a perfect line, each bearing the name of a student who never graduated because a school was promised but never built. At the Supreme Court, former clerks brought stones for colleagues dismissed during colonial restructurings, judges who never wore robes, only silence. Even at the central bank, a quiet trail of stones wound around the polished front plaza, like a whisper through marble miners' clerks, women's cooperatives' names, long erased from account ledgers, now anchored in stone. No cameras captured the moment it became collective, but people felt it. The city didn't shout, it held its breath. One morning as dawn broke gently over the capital, Asetu, Diarra walked through the plaza outside the Ministry of Finance, where hundreds of stones had now formed a curved path, a walkway of names. She walked it slowly, her fingertips grazing the tops of the stones, like reading Braille from another century. Then she looked up. Ibrahim Traoré stood nearby, hands behind his back, observing from a distance. No entourage, no speech, just presence. She approached him quietly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, almost a whisper, "This isn't protest. This is foundation." Traoré didn't respond immediately. His eyes lingered on a single stone with a child's handwriting, the chalk letters still wet from dew. Solimain D. 2007-2017. He died walking for water. He looked at Diarra. How did we let this happen for so long? She didn't answer him directly. Instead, she knelt and adjusted a crooked stone that had shifted in the night. When she stood, she looked not at him, but at the long path now forming stone after stone, step after step. Because silence was cheaper than acknowledgement, she said, but silence has a cost, and now we're counting it. Traoré exhaled. It wasn't frustration, it was recognition. They stood side by side, not as symbols, but as survivors of a history, still writing itself, one that no longer belonged to a courtroom or a parliament, but to the thousands who had begun to speak by laying down memory like bricks. Later that afternoon, someone snapped a photo of the two standing together among the stones. No statement, no ceremony, just a shared stillness. The image went viral not because it was powerful, but because it was honest. By evening, people across other African capitals had begun placing their own stones. In Cotonou, Dakar, Bamako, Yaoundé, Lomé, Kinshasa. They didn't wait for coordination. They simply followed the path, one name at a time. By week's end, the foundation walkway wasn't just a path outside a building. It had become a ritual. Every stone a small resistance. Every name a restoration, and every silence broken, a brick in something new. The ceiling of the grand chamber arched like the hull of an old cathedral, gilded with solemn authority. Heavy mahogany chairs lined the long, U-shaped table velvet cushions untouched. The walls bore paintings of men with powdered wigs, parchment in hand, faces carved in pride. This was not a courtroom of the people. This was a courtroom of precedent. On one side of the chamber sat the French delegation, 12 men and women in navy suits, the Republic's golden crest embossed on their leather portfolios. They came with boxes, at least 7 each, brimming with neatly tabbed binders, reference codes, official seals, and color-coded evidence lists. A microphone hissed softly. A clerk adjusted the height of the central chair. At precisely 0900, the doors opened again. Asetu Diarra stepped in alone. No assistant, no box, no entourage, just a black folder tucked under one arm, and in her other hand a small rounded stone. The French representatives turned politely expectantly. They expected perhaps the legal team a stack of affidavit citations. She gave them none. She approached the central table, placed the stone on its polished surface gently, like setting down a candle in a chapel. Then she placed a single printed page next to it. A scan. Faint lines. Blurry ink. A memo dated 1961. Stamped in the corner, BDF internal, not for release. She remained standing. Then she spoke. I was told justice requires evidence, she began, voice level and steady. So I brought you what we've carried for generations, the stone and the sentence. She paused. No movement. One weighs nothing. The other weighs everything. Across the room, a French delegate leaned forward. Madame Diarra, we have come prepared with full documentation, accounting ledgers, mutual treaties, and ratified accords. If you'll allow, she raised a hand not with aggression, but with finality. I've read your binders, she said. I've studied your conditions, your protocols, your percentages. They are thorough. She looked around the room, not just at the delegates, but at the walls, the emblems, the silent portraits of legal tradition. But there's a difference between a ledger and a loss. You have calculated currency. We have counted names. She tapped the stone once gently. This was laid outside your embassies by children who never met the people it names. And still they spoke. Not for pity, not for vengeance, but to record what your books refused to carry. One of the French advisors shifted uncomfortably. Another binder was opened, then quietly closed again. You will present terms, you will question timelines, you will quote policy. She leaned forward, not in threat, but in gravity. But before you speak of frameworks, know this, we no longer argue for what was taken. We ask who kept it. Silence rippled through the chamber. The presiding chair, an older woman with silver hair and glasses balanced on the bridge of her nose, cleared her throat softly but didn't interrupt. She just watched, and Diarra continued, voice even lower now. This is not the beginning of justice. This is the audit, and we brought memory, not mercy. She stepped back. No applause, no sound, just the weight of truth laid without decoration. The French delegates did not respond. Not yet. They simply sat surrounded by their folders, staring at a single stone, and the ghost of every name it might represent. The chamber was quieter now, less formal, but no less tense. Folders had been opened. Clauses had been read. A timeline was projected on the wall behind the delegation, 1960, 1972, 1994, 2003. Each date marked by a legal document, a treaty, a footnote buried in bureaucratic French. A lawyer from the French side stood confidently and gestured toward a thick binder marked Accord de coopération monétaire, révisé 1999. All transactions were within a legally ratified framework, he said smoothly. All member states retained the right to renegotiate or withdraw. There was no coercion. He spoke the words like code, practiced crisp, devoid of blood. Across the table, Assetou Diarra sat still. Then she stood. No notes, no binder, just her voice. Who wrote the rule? The lawyer blinked. I beg your pardon. She stepped toward the timeline. You quote signatures. I ask who held the pen. You cite cooperation. I ask under what condition the choice was made. You call it shared sovereignty. I call it consent manufactured under dependency. She pointed to one of the dates, 1973, bilateral adjustment clause. This document was signed after a drought year that left over 200,000 without food. That year, Burkina Faso's reserve request was denied. 3 months later, this clause was signed. She turned to the delegates. Tell me, was that negotiation or starvation with a dotted line? No one answered. She walked back to the table, then lifted the original scanned memo she'd brought, the one marked not for release. She held it beside the official public version displayed on screen. Here is the version you published, and here is the one my father found in a desk drawer in 1979. One line missing, just one. Stability must be interpreted as determined solely by Paris. She let the silence return. That line wasn't a typo. It was a truth you tried to bury and edit. Then she leaned forward. So again, I ask, who wrote the rule and who lived with it? She paused, let the words settle. You tell us theft is too harsh a term. Fine, let me rephrase. Her tone shifted. Not softer, but colder. This was not theft. It was prolonged possession without consent. It was interest held hostage. It was access delayed long enough to look like absence. And it was recovery made so impossible you could call it abandonment. She turned back to the screen. If a mother deposits money to build a clinic and it never returns, do you call that a delay? If a farmer's taxes feed an account he'll never touch, do you call that legal? If every treaty hides your advantage in language we didn't write under frameworks we couldn't afford to refuse, then don't call it mutual. Call it empire with a better signature. No one interrupted her now, because they couldn't, because she hadn't just argued. She had shifted the frame, and no binder could refold the world into what it was before she spoke. The judge seated at the head of the chamber scribbled a note quietly. One line, one word. Across the city, a live stream of the hearing had reached over 2 million viewers. In dorm rooms and courtrooms, cafes and ministries, people watched Assetou Diarra stand alone and question the very authorship of their silence. And in a classroom in Dakar, a law professor paused the video and turned to his students. That, he said, is how you cross-examine history. By the third day of hearings, the air inside the grand chamber had changed. Gone was the quiet confidence of opening statements. The binders on the French table were now scattered, some with pages marked and underlined in haste. Behind their speakers, a hastily prepared slide read, Global Financial Stability and Cooperative Risk Management. A senior member of the French delegation stood. His voice was calm but tight around the edges. Your Honors, while we acknowledge the emotional resonance of the claim, we must consider the economic order. A precedent of retroactive asset reclassification, especially regarding reserves, would trigger financial volatility across a dozen central banks. The CFA system is not perfect, but sudden dismantlement would destabilize not just West Africa, but global currency trust. He looked toward the bench, toward Diarra. This is not personal, he said. This is structural. A murmur rolled through the observers' gallery, but Assetou Diarra didn't flinch. She stood. No folder, no rebuttal typed in advance, just the stone still resting in her hands. She walked slowly to the center of the chamber. Every step seemed to echo louder than the last. Then she turned to face the bench of judges. You fear destabilization, she began, voice clear and level. You speak of currency trust, of economic shock, of precedent, but tell me what was stable about a clinic that never opened. What was trustworthy about a reserve we funded but never accessed? What precedent do we protect when silence is older than most of the people in this room? She let the questions hang, not like arrows but like mirrors. You say this isn't personal. I say it's always been personal, just never yours. Her voice sharp and quiet but surgical. You've mistaken denial for discipline, but justice is not a destabilizer. Denial is. She stepped forward closer now to the judges. We are not asking for reparations. We are not demanding apology. We are not debating philosophy. Then with hands steady, she held up the stone. This is not aid. This is return. And with that, she walked to the raised bench normally reserved for judges and clerks and placed the stone gently on its edge. For a moment, no one moved. The chalk was faint now worn by her grip. But the name could still be read, Kadiatu Diarra, 1960-1991. The interest was hers. The silence was not. Diarra took a step back. Her eyes met the chief judge's, not to plead, but to witness. The chamber was still. One of the French legal advisors shifted in his chair, opened his mouth, then closed it. A junior clerk quietly turned off the slide projector, as if embarrassed by its presence. And the judge's eyes remained silent. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to weigh. No ratio to calculate, no model to run, just a stone, small, unshakable, and heavy with memory. Later, that image would travel far, not as a news headline, but as a symbol. It appeared in classrooms, in court protests, even painted on the side of buildings in Dakar, Accra, and Marseille. One stone, one name, one refusal to keep pretending that the math made the silence acceptable. It wasn't read aloud. There was no gavel, no triumphant music, no roaring applause. The ruling appeared quietly on the court's digital bulletin at exactly 17:43, tucked between two unrelated case updates. But everyone knew. By the time the line plaintiff's claim, deemed valid, funds to be returned in full, appeared on screen, dozens of reporters had already gone silent, scanning the words over and over as if waiting for them to change. They didn't. The air in the grand chamber hung heavy, not with shock, but with something far more unsettling for those who had assumed the impossible acceptance. The kind of silence that comes when something long denied is finally irreversibly affirmed. Down the corridor, Asedu Diarra stepped out alone. She held no statement, no press release. Her expression was calm, but her shoulders had lost the tension that had held them for decades. She didn't speak to the press. She didn't need to. The words were already echoing in more than one language, not aid. Return. That night at the presidential residence in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat at his desk surrounded by empty coffee cups, stacks of handwritten letters from across the country, and a single photograph of a stone walkway, the names barely visible in the moonlight. He stared at the laptop screen in front of him. A secure system, no sound, just a blinking message from the central banking network. Transaction completed, amount $400,000 Ajonon. Timestamp, Ijonaru, 107 CET reference article. 44, recovery directive. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if marking a chapter that had finally ended, or perhaps begun. Elsewhere in the city, the people didn't learn about the news from headlines or broadcasts. They felt it in the way street corners suddenly hummed with disbelief, in the way radios switched from pop music to dead air before cautiously returning to the signal. At the main square, someone chalked a new word beside the oldest stone arrived. At 3 a.m., a young girl ran her fingers across the walkway in front of the Ministry of Finance, whispering the names again softly like an old prayer, but this time with a slight tilt in her voice, not just memory but momentum. The world, of course, responded quickly. Analysts scrambled to measure the impact. Currency markets flinched, then steadied. Former colonial powers issued vague statements about recalibration, acknowledgement of historic frameworks, and cooperative next steps. But no one could quite explain how it had happened. No war, no coup, no collapse, just a woman with a stone ledger buried in shadow and a generation that decided silence no longer paid interest. By morning, a single photo began circulating globally, the ministry's front steps blanketed now in over 800 stones each, freshly washed by the evening rain, the chalk words glistening like white scars turned silver. And in one corner of the image, someone had scrawled, "She did not carry documents. She carried the debt." That day, the first official press release from the government read only 3 lines. Date 14. September refunds received. This is not a beginning. This is a return. At 06:02, markets in Asia opened. At 06:17, Nairobi lit up with celebration. At 06:28, an elderly woman in Bobo-Dioulasso swept the walkway of her local clinic, humming a lullaby older than the Republic itself. She didn't own a phone. She hadn't heard the news, but she paused. She looked up at the sky, and she smiled, as if some invisible weight had finally shifted so old it had become indistinguishable from the ground beneath her feet. The sun had barely risen when the Jeep turned off the main road and onto a dirt path carved by seasons, not by engineers. There were no flags on the vehicle, no government emblems, no press vans trailing behind. Just dust crickets and the rhythmic creak of worn shocks bouncing over old ground. President Ibrahim Traoré sat in the passenger seat quiet. He wore a plain shirt, no insignia. His beret lay folded beside him, untouched. By the time they arrived at the school, the sky had burned open, bleached and merciless, swallowing everything in white heat. The building stood like a memory someone had tried to erase. Its roof sagged inward. 2 windows were boarded with planks scavenged from an old market stall. On one wall, faded paint still read, École Primaire Nord, Block B. Inside, there were no desks, just bricks stacked where students once sat. Chalk scribbles still clung to the blackboard like ghost lessons, barely visible numbers that date the word avenir. Traoré stepped inside alone. No entourage, no aides, just a man walking through a skeleton of what should have been a beginning. He ran his fingers along the cracked edge of a wall, then paused near the back corner. On the ground lay an old exercise book, half buried in dust. He picked it up gently. The name on the cover had faded, but the handwriting inside had not Yakuba, age 8. Je veux apprendre pour aider mon village. He closed the book and stood still for a long moment. Then he walked outside, turned to face the windblown yard, and spoke not to cameras but to the few local teachers who had gathered quietly in the shade. "We don't rebuild with slogans," he said. "We rebuild with bricks." One teacher, a woman no older than 30, stepped forward, eyes wide, voice unsteady. "Mr. President, will they really come?" "The builders," he nodded. "Tomorrow. First truck arrives at dawn. Cement wood iron sheets. Enough to start." She blinked as if unsure whether to cry or laugh. He added, "We rebuild from the ground. Not from press conferences. Not from global summits. From here." Then without ceremony, he knelt by the wall and picked up a loose stone from the crumbling foundation. He placed it beside the doorway and whispered something inaudible. Someone later said it was a name. Someone else said it was a promise. That night, no newspapers reported the visit. But the next morning, 5 men arrived in a truck with red dust on their boots and shovels slung over their backs. By midday, the yard echoed with the sound of hammers and laughter, real, ordinary, sweaty laughter. Children gathered at the edge of the field, peeking through the bushes, daring one another to approach. One of them pointed to the blackboard inside and asked, "Is it open again?" The teacher smiled. "Not yet, but it will be." And just like that, a school began to breathe again. Across the country, no official celebrations were held. There were no fireworks, no parades. Just small things, a nurse receiving supplies in a clinic once shuttered a village road, finally leveled a water pump restored. Someone asked Traoré later why there was no ceremony for the funds returned. He simply said, "Because money was never the victory. The victory is what we do without waiting this long again." In the hills of Yatenga, where old colonial roads once disappeared into cracked brush and stubborn silence, asphalt now hummed beneath the feet of children walking to school. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't perfect, but it held. And for the first time in decades, a pregnant woman from a nearby village could reach the nearest health clinic in under 20 minutes, not by donkey cart, not by memory of what used to stand, but by a paved road that reflected the sun like a ribbon of beginning. In Fada Ngurma, a shuttered maternity ward reopened. Nurses wept quietly as they walked through the door. They had once trained there before it closed in 2004 due to lack of funding. Now fresh mattresses lay under mosquito nets, New thermometers lined the shelves, and the solar panels hummed like something sacred. Above the door, a painted sign read, "Built by the people. Return to the people. No ceremony, just function." In the heart of Kudugao, students gathered outside a school whose courtyard had long turned to weeds. The old building had been replaced not by cement blocks, but by walls made of compacted earth and local stone, cheaper, stronger, and made by their own parents. A teacher stood before her class with a handmade sign that read, "Not charity, justice." The children didn't quite understand it yet, but they could feel it. At the back of that same classroom, a boy named Musa slipped a folded note into his backpack addressed to Monsieur le Président. He had written it the night before, after hearing his grandfather talk about the funds returning. The letter read, "Dear President, my grandma was a nurse. She helped people in the war. She didn't have a library to read because there wasn't one. If we can build one now, can we put her name on it? I think books are like nurses for the mind. Love, Musa, age 9. Elsewhere in the capital, a youth cooperative began restoring an abandoned train depot into a community arts center. Not because someone gave them permission, but because now someone finally stopped saying no. A group of former street vendors started a sidewalk microloan program funded by a tiny sliver of the returned reserves. They didn't call it investment. They called it repair. And in homes across the country, the stones that once stood as memorials outside ministries were now being taken home. Not to be forgotten, but to be rooted. People planted flowers next to them. Some wrapped them in cloth. Others built wooden frames around them and placed them on kitchen shelves like silent ancestors. Because now memory was not a burden. It was part of the house. At a small public forum, someone asked a rural teacher, "Do you believe justice was served?" She shook her head gently. "Justice isn't served in one ruling," she said. "Justice is served every time someone stops waiting and starts building." And then she turned back to her blackboard, where her students had written the word of the day in big, messy handwriting, "Restoration." The chalk broke in her hand as she wrote it again. But the word remained. The building looked the same from the outside. The Banque de France, with its stone facade and iron gates, still stood like a fortress in the heart of Paris. Tourists passed it without a second glance, mistaking its grandeur for permanence, its silence for pride. But inside, everything had changed. On a gray morning in October, with no press conference, no ribbon cutting, and no national anthem, a simple statement was posted on the bank's official website. In recognition of historical imbalances and prolonged structural asymmetry, the Banque de France hereby acknowledges its role in the retention of financial assets from its former African partners during the post-colonial transition era. We issue a formal apology to the people of Burkina Faso. The archives are now open. BDF 12, October. The world read it twice, because no one expected it, and even those who believed it would one day come didn't expect it would come like this, not with thunder, but with a quiet, unmistakable click, the sound of a vault unlocking not money but memory. Within hours, decades of sealed documents were uploaded to the public archive, handwritten notes from colonial officers, memos between Paris and Ouagadougou, internal debates about liquidity controls, interest redirection, block transfers, letters marked confidential in fading ink. One page was especially stark. Delaying full release of reserves may create controlled dependency. This is advantageous for regional monetary leverage. Memorandum, 1972, Département des Affaires étrangères. People printed it, posted it, projected it onto walls in Ouagadougou, Dakar, Lomé. One artist painted it across an abandoned train station and crossed out the word advantageous, replacing it with engineered silence. And then came the plaque. It was commissioned not by the French government but by a coalition of students, half French, half West African, who raised the funds online in under 72 hours. It was carved in black granite, minimalist but deliberate. On it were 3 words: liberté, restitution, fraternité. It was placed at the steps of the Banque de France beside a new installation, a single glass case containing a stone. On the stone was written in careful childlike script, Awa, 1963 to 1978. She waited. People stopped to look. Not everyone agreed with it. Some called it unnecessary. Others called it too little too late. but no one could unsee it. The vault was open now, and it wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. Universities in Belgium began re-evaluating the legal language of old treaties. Activists in Côte d'Ivoire requested access to their own files. A symposium at The Hague was scheduled under the title Beyond Apology, Fiscal Memory, and the Post-Colonial Ledger. In a small town outside Marseille, a retired banker mailed his journals to a school in Ouagadougou. He enclosed a note. "I stamped the papers. I knew what I was doing. I hope this helps you undo it." And in Ouagadougou, Traoré didn't release a statement. Instead, he stood before a classroom filled with students, lifted a document just unsealed from the archive, one that showed exactly how much had been diverted from Burkina Faso's school fund between 1967 and 1984, and simply read the number aloud. He didn't have to explain what it meant. The silence that followed was louder than grief. One student raised their hand and asked if they wrote the rules. "Can we write new ones?" Traoré nodded. "That's exactly the point." Outside the school gates, someone had drawn a map of Africa on the wall with dust and chalk, but this time it wasn't marked by borders. It was marked with names, years, and numbers, tiny inscriptions of those who had been forgotten by history books, but remembered by the stones. For the first time in over a century, the Banque de France wasn't just a place of withholding. It was a place that had finally released something no vault could contain forever: the truth. The old vault was never meant to be touched by sunlight. Its walls were nearly a meter thick, designed to hold the weight of history, not history itself, but its currency. Cold, impenetrable. The kind of space built not for people, but for possession. Now it smelled faintly of earth. The steel doors that once sealed off billions were removed, their hinges donated to an engineering school in Dakar. In their place stood a wide-open archway framed with local sandstone, and above it a carved inscription in 3 languages, French, Moray, and English. This room once held what could not be returned. Now it holds what must grow. Inside, where the ledgers once slept in darkness, sunlight streamed through a geometric skylight. Not blinding just enough to warm the stone floor where visitors now walked in soft shoes, whispering not because of rules, but because of awe. In the center of the vault stood a single young baobab tree, its roots protected in a bed of nutrient-rich soil carried in from both Burkina Faso and France. The soil was mixed deliberately, layer by layer, as a living metaphor. History cannot be separated, but it can be shared. The tree was no taller than a teenager, but its trunk was already wide, sturdy, quietly defiant. Surrounding it were shallow planters filled with native herbs from both countries, hibiscus, mint, neri, lavender, and small nameplates that read not the scientific Latin, but the local names, the grandmother names, the names that survived through kitchens and lullabies. Glass displays encircled the vault walls, where declassified documents were now preserved, not behind alarms, but under soft light. Visitors could touch digital replicas, flip through timelines, hear audio recordings of testimony, and in one corner sit and listen to the voices of elders explaining what each ledger entry had cost them. But the tree was always the center. Every week, groups of school children visited from both France and Burkina Faso. They came in matching uniforms, wide-eyed, fidgeting with nervous energy, unsure whether they were in a museum, a classroom, or something older. Their teachers told them, "This is a garden, but it used to be a vault." Most of them didn't fully understand, but they could feel it, especially when they were given small clay medallions to write a name on and bury in the soil beneath the baobab. The names didn't have to be famous. They just had to be remembered. One boy from Lyon wrote his great-grandmother's name. She had worked as a cleaner in a government building her whole life and never spoke of the war. A girl from Ouagadougou wrote the name of her uncle who taught her math under a mango tree when their school had no roof. And every Friday at noon, the garden would fall silent for 1 minute. Not in mourning, but in breath. The vault had once held wealth no one could touch. Now it held a future everyone could feel growing, quietly, leaf by leaf. The baobab had not yet borne fruit, but it was alive, and that for the first time in a very long time was enough. He arrived without a motorcade. No reporters followed, no sirens cut the air. Just a single unmarked vehicle rolling through the morning mist of Paris, stopping quietly at the side entrance of the old Banque de France. No one expected Ibrahim Traoré to return. Not now, not like this. Inside the museum, staff didn't recognize him at first. He wore no uniform, only a charcoal coat and scuffed boots. He nodded politely to the security guard, signed the visitor log with only his initials, and walked past the exhibits without slowing. His steps were deliberate, as if he already knew the way. Down the ramp, past the archive cases, past the faded ledgers and whispering audio stations, past the digital timelines and glowing tablets, into the garden. The room was empty save for a few caretakers trimming the outer hedges of hibiscus. The baobab stood steady at the center, its leaves trembling gently under the skylight's filtered sun. He stepped forward, and then he knelt. No camera caught it, no speech was made. But for those who later heard the story from the gardeners, the moment lived on, not in video but in breath. He knelt before the tree like someone greeting an old friend, one hand pressed to the earth, the other resting on his knee fingers, brushing the edge of the mixed soil red dust of West Africa, pale loam of France. He stayed there, eyes closed. Then he spoke. Growth was never meant to be locked. The words were not loud, but the silence around them made them eternal. A few minutes passed. One of the museum staff, a young man from Aix-en-Provence, stepped forward with uncertainty. Monsieur le Président, would you like to add a message to the tree? Traoré looked up, smiled faintly. No need. But if the tree will accept one more truth, let it be this. He pulled a folded scrap of paper from his pocket. It had been torn from a notebook smudged with graphite and dust. On it was written in block handwriting, "Not all wealth is counted in coins." He handed it to the young man, who nodded slowly and walked it over to the plaque maker's bench. By evening, the sign had been carved, modest, simple, fixed to a stone beneath the tree. Visitors began to stop and read it, sometimes twice. Some smiled. Others just stood still for a moment, staring at the soil below, as if searching for something buried deeper than roots. Traoré left without saying goodbye. He walked out the way he came in. No handshakes, no flashbulbs, no farewell. But before he passed the garden's archway, he paused, glanced once over his shoulder, and whispered, not to anyone in the room, but perhaps to the room itself, "Let no one guard silence again." Then he was gone. That night, a school teacher from Lyon brought her students to visit the vault for the first time. As they entered the garden, one of the children pointed to the new sign and asked, "But what else is wealth if not coins?" The teacher smiled. "Memory," she said. "Truth. Roots. A name that's not forgotten." The child nodded slowly, and as they circled the baobab, one of them reached into her backpack and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside, a pebble from her grandmother's garden wrapped in paper that read, "For the soil that gave me a voice." She placed it gently at the base of the tree, and the tree stood still, but somehow it felt like it heard. The sky was the color of warm clay when the crowd gathered. They came not because they were summoned, but because somehow word had passed from village to village, whispered between vendors, sung in classrooms, scrawled in chalk on the backs of old benches. President Ibrahim Traoré was going to speak. No stage was erected, no music played. Just a wooden platform outside the town square in Zorgo, a quiet village with no airport, no monument, just clean roads, a rebuilt school and a wide clearing where people could stand shoulder to shoulder without pushing forward. He stepped up alone, his red beret in hand. He looked older but not tired, lighter somehow. The microphones worked, but they weren't needed. The crowd had fallen into the kind of silence only history demands. He began simply, "I was never meant to stay." A few murmurs. A child coughed. Leadership is not a crown. It is a bridge. It is not something you keep. It's something you hold long enough so others can cross. He paused, looking out across the faces, young, old, lined with dust and sweat, and something deeper understanding. The money returned was not mine. The justice earned was not mine. The work, the stones, the names, they were yours. And so today I return this office to you. A quiet gasp. Some expected another term. Others hoped for it, but no one moved. I will not run again, because leadership is not possession, it is presence. And presence is something you pass on. A woman in the front row began to cry, not from sadness, but from something harder to name. Behind her, an elder in a woven hat lifted his hand and placed it over his heart. Traoré's voice softened. A lantern on a hill does not last forever, but if it's placed well, it lights the next path. I believe you will walk it better than I ever did. He stepped down. No anthem played, no chants followed. Just the sound of hundreds of people weeping in stillness, not in grief, but in recognition. The kind of tears that come when power leaves not by force, but by choice. In the northern hills, far from the speeches and screens, an old man walked barefoot down a new paved road. He held something in his hand, a stone smooth and dark with letters carved carefully in white. He stopped where the road met the entrance to a small health outpost, one that had opened only 3 months ago. The building was simple concrete tin roof, one solar panel blinking in the sun. The old man bent down, knees creaking, and laid the stone into the soil by the edge of the road. His voice, though weak, was steady. She died waiting for medicine. Now her name is part of the road. The name on the stone read Aminata, 1944-2001. She walked. Now others arrive. He stood back, brushing his palms together slowly. Nearby, a group of children watched without speaking. One of them whispered, "That's the last stone." Another replied, "No, that's the first of the next ones." Across the country, the phrase began to travel, not in textbooks, not in headlines, just murmured in markets and bus stops under trees. We are not poor. We were never paid. It was not defiance. It was remembrance. A quiet reckoning that no longer needed permission. A farmer painted it on the back of a water tank. A teacher wrote it across the top of every exam paper. A poet scribbled it on a napkin in a cafe in Marseille and left it behind. It became not a slogan, but a mirror. And in the reflection, the nation stood not with fists raised, but with backs straighter, voices steadier, and names remembered. The road shimmered under the morning heat, but the boy ran anyway. In one hand, he held a book too large for his backpack, its pages flapping with each step. In the other, a rolled-up blueprint, half crumpled from the run. He darted past goats, waved at two women carrying water, and finally skidded to a stop in front of a large sign hammered into the red earth. It read, "Under construction, National Technical Institute for Renewable Engineering, for those who never stopped walking." Beyond the sign, workers hammered steel into beams. Bricks stacked neatly beside rebar. Scaffolding reached into the sky like unfinished dreams. The boy pressed his hands against the fence. He was maybe 10, maybe younger. His shirt was too big, his eyes too curious. He looked down at the blueprint. He'd drawn crooked lines, misspelled labels, a stick figure holding up a wrench. One day he whispered, "I'll build the next one." A woman in a hard hat overheard him. She walked over and smiled. "You an engineer?" "Not yet," he said. She knelt beside him and pointed to his drawing. "Looks like you already are." He grinned, then carefully folded the blueprint, slid the book back into his arms, and turned to leave. But before he did, he looked up at the sign one more time. His lips moved as he read the words aloud. "For those who never stopped walking," and then he walked on. The dust rose behind him, the sun rose ahead of him, and the road like the dream kept going. This story reminds us that justice isn't always loud. It can be quiet, steady, and deeply human. Traoré and Diarra didn't fight with force, but with memory, dignity, and truth. They showed us that real leadership is not about control, but about creating space for others to rise. It's a powerful reminder that what's stolen can be returned, but what's remembered can rebuild. In a world so focused on power, maybe it's time we value presence more. What would justice look like in your community, not as punishment, but as restoration? Let's reflect together. If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or some societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.